The boy had been inside the locked SUV for 23 minutes before anyone did a single thing about it. 23 minutes. July heat. Windows sealed. A child's hand pressed flat against dark glass like he was trying to reach through the world itself. People stood around that gas station parking lot and argued. About liability. About legality. About whether it was really their problem. And then a shadow fell across the asphalt. Long, heavy, carrying the sound of a Harley engine that hadn't fully died yet, and everything changed. This is the story of a man who stopped when the whole world kept driving, and what that single decision cost him, and what it saved. If this story hits something real inside you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Stay with me until the very end. I promise you, this one is worth it. The heat that summer was the kind that made people mean. It pressed down on Coopersville, Tennessee, like a hand on the back of a neck. Insistent, suffocating, personal. By mid-July, the grass along the highway shoulders had gone the color of old bone. The cicadas screamed from the tree lines every single afternoon, and nobody could remember what a cool morning felt like anymore. People drove with their windows up and their air conditioning cranked and their eyes straight ahead, and they did not look at other people on the road, because looking at other people on the road meant acknowledging that other people existed, and acknowledging that other people existed meant possibly having to care about them, and caring about people in heat like this was an expense nobody wanted to afford. Mason Mercer had been riding since 5:30 in the morning to beat the worst of it. He was 45 years old, and he looked every single year of that, plus a few more that weren't his by birthright but had been acquired anyway. In sand, in field hospitals, in the particular darkness that follows a man home from places he was never supposed to talk about. He rode a 2009 Harley-Davidson Road King that he had rebuilt twice with his own hands, the second time after a crash that should have killed him, and nearly did. The bike was not pretty. It had scars the same way Mason had scars. Places where the metal had been folded back and re-welded, where the paint didn't quite match, where something had been broken and put back together not perfectly, but permanently. He wouldn't have traded it for anything. He wore his leather cut over a gray t-shirt that was already dark with sweat at the collar and under the arms. The cut bore the patches of the Iron Covenant MC, not a name that meant anything to most people in Coopersville, and Mason preferred it that way. The chapter was small. 12 members, all of them veterans, most of them carrying damage in the specific way that combat damage accumulates, quietly, internally, in ways that occasionally made normal people uncomfortable at dinner parties. Not that any of them went to dinner parties, not that they were invited. Mason rode because the road was the only thing that asked nothing of him. He pulled into the Sunway gas station at exit 47 just after 7:15 a.m. because his tank was running low and because he'd had a coffee 3 hours ago that had turned cold and terrible in his stomach, and he needed something to replace it. The station was already busy for that hour. 2 18-wheelers at the diesel pumps, a minivan with out-of-state plates, a pickup truck with a cracked rear window, 3 or 4 cars spread across the regular pumps. The kind of place that existed purely as a transaction between a person and their vehicle, and then vanished from memory entirely. He parked at the far end of the lot, away from the pumps. Old habit, he always positioned where he could see the exits. He was halfway to the station door when he noticed the SUV. It was a dark green Ford Explorer, maybe 10 years old, parked in the first row of the lot beside a concrete divider. The engine was off. The windows were up. It was angled so that the passenger side faced slightly away from the station, which was why Mason noticed it from where he was standing, and maybe why nobody else had. You'd have to be at the right angle, looking in the right direction, to catch what was on the other side of that glass. A small hand, pressed flat against the rear passenger window, fingers spread. Mason stopped walking. He stood there for 3 full seconds, which doesn't sound like a long time, but is actually a very long time when something is wrong. And he looked at that hand, and the hand did not move. It was pressed flat and still, and the fingers were slightly curled at the tips, the way a hand goes when someone is leaning their whole weight against a surface for support. He changed direction. The SUV was hotter than the air around it. You could feel the heat radiating off the metal before you got close, that particular shimmer and press that a sealed vehicle accumulates in direct sunlight. Mason came around the passenger side and put his face close to the window and looked through the dark-tinted glass, and what he saw was a child. A small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, wearing a red t-shirt that was soaked through with sweat, slumped sideways against the door with one hand still pressing against the window. The boy's eyes were open, barely. His lips were dry and cracked at the corners. His face had the slackness of someone whose body had been working very hard for a very long time and was starting to lose the argument. Mason tried the door handle. Locked. He tried the other doors. All locked. He looked through the front windows. No keys in the ignition, no phone visible, nothing that would tell him where the driver was or how long the boy had been alone. He looked back toward the station. There were people at the pumps. There was a woman near the minivan talking on her phone. There was a man walking out of the station with a coffee and a bag of chips. "Hey!" Mason's voice came out rougher than he intended. He raised it. "Hey, there's a kid locked in this vehicle." The man with the coffee looked over. So did the woman on the phone. Neither of them moved. Mason went to the station door and pulled it open, and the cold air hit him like a wall, and he walked straight to the counter where a teenage kid in a red vest was staring at his phone. "There's a child locked in a car in your lot," Mason said. "Green Explorer, first row. He's in distress. I need you to get on your intercom and page whoever owns that vehicle right now." The teenager looked up. He was maybe 17 with acne along his jaw and the particular glazed look of someone working an opening shift they didn't want to be working. Now," Mason said. The kid fumbled for the intercom. The page crackled through the speakers. "Attention customers. We have a child locked in a vehicle in the parking lot, green Ford Explorer. Please come to the front counter immediately." Mason was already walking back out. By the time he got to the SUV, there were 4 people standing around it. The woman from the minivan had ended her phone call and was peering through the front windshield. The man with the coffee was standing back with his arms crossed. A third person, a heavy-set man in a polo shirt, was trying the door handles the same way Mason had. A fourth, a younger woman in scrubs, was on her phone. "I'm calling 911, she said. "Good," Mason said. "How long has he been in there?" "I don't know. I just noticed." "Did anyone see when that vehicle parked?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. The boy's hand had slid down the window slightly. Mason watched it happen, and something clenched in his chest, not with emotion exactly, but with the cold, practical recognition of a man who had spent 3 years as a combat medic, watching the difference between someone who had time and someone who didn't. The boy didn't have much time. "Dispatch says maybe 15 minutes?" the woman in scrubs said, still on the phone. "He doesn't have 15 minutes, Mason said. "The police are coming." "Did you hear what I said?" She looked at him. She took in the leather cut, the tattoos climbing up both forearms, the scar that ran along the left side of his jaw, the size of him. He saw her make a calculation. He saw the calculation come up with the wrong answer. "Sir, I understand you're concerned, but breaking into someone's vehicle—" "That child is in heat distress," Mason said. He wasn't yelling. His voice was flat and even, which was actually more alarming. Core body temperature in a sealed vehicle climbs 1 to 2 degrees every 10 minutes. He's been in there long enough that he's already showing cognitive symptoms. If his temperature reaches 104 degrees, he will start seizing. If it reaches 107, he will sustain brain damage or die. I'm going to break this window. You can't just move back, Mason said. He pulled his Harley bandana from his back pocket, not for drama, but because he'd need a clean grip, and wrapped it around his right hand twice. He looked at the window. He looked at the boy. He picked a point on the lower corner of the glass where the structural tension would be lowest, and he drove his elbow into it with everything he had. The window exploded inward. Heat poured out of the opening like something that had been waiting, dense, stale, chemical-smelling, the particular suffocating warmth of a closed space that had been baking in direct sunlight for God knows how long. Mason reached in and unlocked the door and pulled it open, and the wave of heat hit him physically, like a shove, and then he was reaching inside and getting his hands on the boy. He was so small. That was the thing Mason would remember later, in the specific inventory of moments his brain insisted on keeping. The boy was so small and so limp, and his skin was burning to the touch. Not the normal surface warmth of a summer child, but the deep internal heat of a body fighting something it was losing ground against. His breathing was shallow, fast and shallow. His eyes opened slightly when Mason lifted him, and something moved in them. Not recognition, not fear exactly, just a flicker of awareness registering that something had changed. "Hey," Mason said quietly. He carried the boy away from the SUV toward the narrow shadow on the station's north wall where the sun hadn't reached yet. "Hey, buddy, I got you. You're okay." The boy's lips moved. Nothing came out. "Don't talk. Save it." Mason sat down on the concrete with his back against the wall and the boy against his chest, and he started the assessment the way he'd done it 100 times in conditions considerably worse than a Tennessee gas station parking lot. Pulse rapid and weak. Skin hot and dry. No sweating, which was bad, which meant the cooling mechanism had already started shutting down. Respiratory rate elevated. He was maybe 1.5 pounds of awareness away from unconsciousness. "Does anybody have water?" Mason said, not looking up. The woman in scrubs was suddenly crouching beside him. She'd changed her calculation. "I have water in my car. Cold if you have it. And something for his neck and wrists. Ice pack, cold cloth, anything." She ran. The man in the polo shirt was on his phone now. The woman from the minivan was standing with her hand over her mouth. A small crowd had gathered. 6 or 7 people materialized from wherever they'd been, the way crowds always do when something has already happened and the worst is hopefully over. Someone had found a bottle of water and was holding it out. Someone else was asking questions that Mason didn't answer because answering questions was not the most important thing happening right now. He took the water. He dribbled a small amount across the boy's lips, tilted just enough to wet them. Waited. Did it again. He pressed his fingers against the inside of the boy's wrist and counted. He talked to him, low and steady, not saying anything in particular, just maintaining the threat of a voice, which was something he'd learned in places he didn't like to think about. That sometimes a voice is the thing that keeps someone tethered when everything else is letting go. "You're all right," Mason said. "Stay with me. You're all right." The boy's eyes opened fully for the first time. They were brown, very dark brown, and large, and they looked up at Mason with the particular stripped-down clarity of a child who has moved past fear and arrived somewhere quieter on the other side of it. He stared at Mason's face for a long moment, at the scar, at the beard, at the cut with its patches, at all the visible damage that Mason carried on the surface. Then very quietly the boy said, "Are you a motorcycle man?" Mason's breath caught somewhere in his chest. He didn't let it show. "Yeah," he said. "I am." "My dad rode motorcycles," the boy said. And then the ambulance pulled into the lot with its lights going, and the crowd parted, and the world picked up its rhythm again. And Mason stayed exactly where he was until a paramedic was crouching in front of him saying, "Sir, we've got him, sir." "You can let go now," and Mason realized he was still holding the boy like something he couldn't afford to put down. He let go. He stood. He stepped back. He watched them work with the professional remove of a man who had done this himself, who had been on the other side of that, hands and equipment and training, and knew when to trust it and step aside. They were good. The boy was responding. Color was coming back. It was going to be okay. Mason walked back to his bike and sat on it and lit a cigarette and smoked it down to the filter without tasting it. His hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing about the training. It kept your hands steady in the moment and let everything else hit you afterward, delayed, in the dark, when you were alone and there was nothing left to do. 2 patrol cars had arrived. A deputy with a young face and a practiced look of authority was moving through the crowd taking statements. He came to Mason eventually, looking at the cut, looking at the broken window of the SUV, looking at Mason with the expression of a man who had already started working out how to write this report. "Sir, you're the one who broke the vehicle window?" "Yes." "Can I get your name and ID?" Mason gave them. The deputy wrote things down. He asked Mason to stay available for follow-up questions. He used words like destruction of property and extenuating circumstances in the same sentence and seemed to be working something out in real time about which category this fell into, and Mason watched him work it out and said nothing to assist the process. What interested Mason more was the woman. She had arrived while the ambulance was still there, on foot, running from the direction of the station's interior, still holding a receipt and a bottle of soda that she'd clearly just purchased. She was maybe mid-30s, with dark circles under her eyes that weren't from last night, but from the accumulation of many nights. And she was wearing the specific combination of scrubs top and jeans that said, "I came from one job, and I'm going to another." And her face when she saw the paramedics and the ambulance and the broken glass on the asphalt went through about 4 expressions in 2 seconds, all of them terrible. She knew. Before she saw the boy, she already knew it was him. "Eli," her voice came out cracked. She pushed through the small remaining crowd, and the paramedics parted, and the boy, Eli, Mason filed the name, turned his head, and saw her, and something in his face came completely undone in the way that small children's faces do when the person they've been waiting for finally arrives. "Mama!" She fell to her knees on the asphalt without caring about the asphalt, and gathered him into her arms and held him there and made a sound that Mason turned away from because it was private. Some sounds don't have any business being witnessed by strangers. He heard the deputy talking to her a moment later. Heard the words, "Locked in the vehicle, ma'am. Possibly around 20 to 30 minutes. We believe the door mechanism malfunctioned when he pulled it shut." Mason finished his second cigarette. He was about to start his bike. The woman, Eli's mother, appeared beside him. She'd been crying, but she wasn't anymore. She had the look of a woman who allowed herself very little crying time, who had learned to get through the necessary amount and then close the door on it and continue. She was looking at Mason with an expression that was complex enough that he couldn't read it cleanly. "You're the one who got him out," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "The window... I'll pay for it." She blinked. That clearly wasn't where she'd been going. "That's... No, I'm not..." She stopped. She seemed to be rearranging herself internally. "I just wanted to say thank you." "You don't have to." "I do." She said it like it was a fact and not a sentiment. "He got in through the back. He does that sometimes. He loves the car. He climbs in while I run in somewhere, and the door must have locked when he pulled it shut, and I didn't know he'd followed me in, and..." Her voice got unsteady at the edges. She pressed her lips together. "He was in there the whole time I was standing in line. I was standing in line for 8 minutes buying a soda, and he was..." "He's okay," Mason said. "The paramedics have him stable. He's going to be okay." She looked at him. The full look, not the peripheral one people gave him in public when they were trying to assess his threat level without being obvious about it. She looked at the cut, at the patches, at the scar, at the smoke still curling from the cigarette he'd rested on the side mirror. "Are you Iron Covenant?" she said. Mason was quiet for a moment. "You know us?" "My husband..." She stopped. Past tense had a way of arriving in sentences like that, unexpected and absolute. "My late husband. He had friends in the biker community. I've seen the patch before." Mason said nothing. "He passed 14 months ago," she said. "Car accident, not a motorcycle, just a road, and a truck that came into his lane, and that was..." She stopped again. "I'm Rachel," she said instead. "Rachel Parker. And the boy you pulled out of that car is named Eli, and he is the only thing in the world I can't afford to lose." She said it without drama. Just information, clear-eyed and direct, the way people state true things when they've already made their peace with the weight of them. Mason looked at her for a moment. He thought about the boy's eyes looking up at him. He thought about, "My dad rode motorcycles." "Mason Mercer," he said. He did not offer his hand because his right hand still had glass dust on it from the window. "Make sure they check his temperature again in an hour. Heat distress can restabilize and then drop again." "I will." He started his bike. He didn't look back. That was the policy. You showed up when it mattered. You did what needed doing. You moved on. That was the rule, and Mason had kept it for years because the alternative, caring about what happened after, letting the story follow you, that was the thing that made everything harder. He didn't look back. But that night, in the small house he rented on the eastern edge of Coopersville, Mason sat at his kitchen table with a bottle of water he wasn't drinking and stared at the wall for a long time. He thought about a small hand pressed flat against dark glass. He thought about the weight of a child who trusts you completely, simply because there is no one else. He thought about, my dad rode motorcycles. He told himself it was over. He was wrong. Son, he went back to the hospital the next morning. He told himself it was just to check on the kid. Verify the outcome. He would have done it for anyone. That was what he told himself for the 15-mile ride from his house to Coopersville Regional Medical Center, and he mostly believed it. And then he walked into the pediatric ward, and the nurse at the station told him Eli Parker was in room 14 and doing much better. And Mason said thank you and started walking down the hall before he registered that he'd asked which room the kid was in without being conscious of deciding to ask. He paused outside room 14. He could hear voices, low, a child's voice and a woman's voice, the specific cadence of a mother talking a child through something unpleasant. Eli's voice asking something and Rachel's voice answering it with the kind of patience that sounded like it was being maintained through effort rather than ease. Mason knocked. Rachel opened the door. She looked less fractured than the day before, still carrying every ounce of what she'd been carrying when they met, but steadier. The way people get steady when the worst immediate thing has passed and they've had a few hours to reconstitute themselves. She was in different clothes, still the same eyes, dark, tired, watchful, not unfriendly. Mr. Mercer. Mason. How is he? She opened the door wider. Eli was sitting up in the hospital bed with a tablet propped on his knees, wearing a paper-thin gown printed with small blue stars, an IV taped to his left hand. When he saw Mason, he went completely still in the particular way children go still when they are trying to figure out whether something is real. Hey, Eli, Mason said. You're the motorcycle man, Eli said. Yeah. You broke the window. I did. Eli considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old working through a moral question. Mama says you're not supposed to break windows. Generally, no. But you did it anyway. Yeah. Eli nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected about the nature of adults. Then, do you have a motorcycle outside? It's in the parking lot. What kind? Harley Davidson. Road King. Eli's face did something that had nothing to do with the IV or the hospital or the heat distress of the day before. My dad had a motorcycle, he said. Your mom mentioned that. He had a Harley too. He let me sit on it sometimes. He paused. He's dead now. Mason held the boy's gaze. He didn't look away, didn't soften it, didn't offer any of the things adults usually offered children in that moment. He just held the gaze and said quietly, I know. I'm sorry. Eli looked at him. Then he looked back at his tablet. He pressed play on whatever he'd been watching. Mason stayed for 20 minutes. He didn't talk much. He sat in the vinyl chair beside the window, and Rachel sat in the other chair, and Eli watched his tablet, and occasionally told them facts about whatever he was watching, and they listened, and that was all it was. Just that. A room, and a morning, and a small boy who was alive because a window had been broken. When Mason stood to leave, Rachel walked him to the door. You didn't have to come, she said. I know. She was quiet for a moment. He's been asking about motorcycles all morning, she said. He was asking before Michael died too. He was always asking. Michael was going to take him for a real ride when he got big enough. She stopped. He never got big enough in time. Mason said nothing because there was nothing to say to that. The nurses like him, Rachel said. He told the night nurse that a scary motorcycle man saved his life, and then he made her promise not to tell me he said scary. She looked at Mason. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face. She told me anyway. They usually do, Mason said. He walked out. He took the elevator down. He crossed the lobby and pushed through the glass doors and walked across the parking lot to his bike and sat on it and did not start it for a full 2 minutes. Scary motorcycle man. He started the bike. He rode. 4 days passed. Mason worked in the chapter's garage, which occupied a rented space on the industrial side of Coopersville, where nobody came looking unless they needed something welded or an engine pulled. The garage smelled like oil and metal shavings, and the particular brand of cigarette that Dozer, real name Thomas Whelan, called Dozer since 2008, for reasons that had to do with an incident in Fallujah that nobody discussed, smoked in the specific way of men who have decided that the risks of cigarettes are funny in context. The garage had a coffee maker that produced coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through something that hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration, and everyone drank it anyway, and it was the best part of most mornings. Dozer was rebuilding a transmission on a 2003 Sportster that belonged to a woman in town who had inherited the bike from her brother and was determined to learn to ride it, which Dozer respected on principle. He was a large man, 6'3", and constructed like something industrial, with a shaved head and a beard going gray at the chin, and a scar across his left knuckles where a piece of shrapnel had caught him in a way that would have taken 3 fingers if it had been half an inch to the right. He'd been Mason's closest friend for 11 years, which was long enough that they didn't need to maintain conversations, but could run in silence for hours, and it didn't mean anything negative. "Heard you broke a car window at the Sunway station," Dozer said, not looking up from the transmission. "Word travels. Mikey Yuntz was there. His kid was at the pump behind you." Mason handed Dozer a wrench without being asked. "Boy's okay. Mikey said you were talking the paramedics through it before they got there." "They didn't need me." Mikey said it differently. Dozer set down the wrench and picked up a rag and looked at Mason from across the bike. "He said you sat down on that concrete with the kid and talked him back from wherever he was going. Said you didn't look like a man who was doing a thing. Said you looked like a man who knew exactly what he was doing because he'd done it before, and it was just where he lived." Mason said nothing. "Said the mother was something," Dozer added. "Leave it." "I'm not doing anything. I'm just transmitting information." "Then stop." Dozer went back to the transmission. He was quiet for a while in the way that was actually full of things he wasn't saying, which was a method he'd perfected over 2 decades of military and post-military life. Then, "You going back?" Mason was quiet. "Because if you're going back," Dozer said, "that's not nothing. I went to check on the kid. I go, I check, I come back. That's it." "Right. It's not a thing. Okay. I mean it." "Mason." Dozer looked at him again. He had the eyes of a man who had spent a long time paying attention to things people didn't say. "I said, okay." On day 5, Mason drove past Rachel's house. He wasn't going to the house. He was on his way to the hardware store on the same street, and he happened to drive past it, and he noticed, because he noticed things, it was wired in, it was not something he could turn off, that the fence along the left side of the property had 2 broken posts and a section of chain link that had pulled free of its moorings and was leaning at an angle that suggested the next moderate wind would put it on the ground entirely. He went to the hardware store. He got what he came for. He drove home. He came back the next morning with fence posts and a bag of concrete and a post hole digger and a set of wire clips, and he spent 2.5 hours fixing the fence while Rachel was at work and Eli was at his summer day program, and when he was finished, he drove away without telling anyone he'd been there. Dozer found out anyway. Dozer always found out. "You fixed her fence," he said. It wasn't a question. There was a code violation waiting to happen. Right. The posts were rotted through. Right. It's a liability issue. Dozer looked at Mason for a long, even moment. Then he nodded slowly and went back to what he was doing and did not say another word about it. And that was the thing about Dozer. He knew when he'd already won the point. 3 days later, Mason came back. He'd found at a surplus store a small die-cast model of a Harley-Davidson Road King, maybe 6 inches long, in the same basic color as his own bike. It was the kind of thing that cost $4 and was made for children, and Mason had stood in the aisle of the surplus store for an uncomfortable amount of time before picking it up. He left it on Rachel's front step. He rang the bell and walked back to his bike and was halfway down the block when he heard the front door open behind him. "Mason?" He stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He made himself breathe once, twice, and then he turned. Rachel was standing in the doorway in jeans and a faded t-shirt from what had probably once been a hospital fundraising event. She was holding the model motorcycle. She looked at him across the small front yard with the chain link fence standing straight and properly mortared behind her, and she said, "This was you?" He waited. "The fence?" she said. "That was you." It was a hazard. She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the small motorcycle in her hand. "Eli is going to—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, with something at the back of it that she was working not to let forward. You don't have to do this. I know. We're not your responsibility. I know that too. She was quiet. She looked at the motorcycle again. He's going to want to show you his room, she said. He has posters. His dad put them up before. He has motorcycle posters all over his walls, and he's going to want to explain every single one to you, and I'm warning you because it takes a while. Mason said nothing for a moment. That a problem? Rachel said. No, Mason said. It's not a problem. He stayed for 90 minutes that afternoon. Eli showed him every poster. There were 7 of them, taped at slightly different heights because Eli had done most of the positioning himself after his father's hands were no longer available to help, and narrated each one with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old conveying information he considered important. He knew the names of various models with the unconscious authority of a child who has absorbed something deeply and doesn't realize not everyone carries that same knowledge. He knew what a Road King was. He knew what a Softail was. He had opinions about the relative merits of specific years that he had clearly inherited from someone who was no longer there to hold those opinions himself. Mason listened to every word, not performed listening, not the polite halfway present listening of adults managing children's monologues while their minds were elsewhere. He actually listened because the boy was not actually talking about motorcycles. The boy was talking about his father, using motorcycles as the language for it, and Mason had enough experience with the specific architecture of grief to recognize when someone was saying 2 things at once. Rachel made coffee. It was good coffee, better than the garage coffee maker by considerable measure, and Mason drank it standing in the kitchen doorway while Eli continued the tour with the model motorcycle now clutched in both hands. And Mason noticed things about the house the way he always noticed things. The empty hook beside the door where a second set of keys would go. The stack of bills on the counter with the top one's window showing a number that wasn't catastrophic but was not comfortable. The small school photo on the refrigerator of Eli in a blue-collared shirt grinning so wide it was almost alarming. Beside it, a photo that had to be Michael Parker. Dark-haired, brown eyes, same as Eli's. A smile that was the source of the boys. A man at maybe 32 or 33, holding a motorcycle helmet, standing in what looked like a driveway. Looking at it felt like something Mason didn't have a name for. He left when Eli started to wind down toward dinner, which happened in the specific way 6-year-olds wind down, abruptly, with a shift in the quality of the air around them, like a switch being moved. Rachel walked him to the door. Eli was already in the kitchen eating cereal directly from the box, which apparently was his current preferred mode of pre-dinner nutrition. He's going to ask if you'll come back, Rachel said at the door, low enough that the kitchen couldn't hear. I just want to prepare you. He's going to ask. What do you want me to say? She looked at him. She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. I want you to tell him the truth, she said. Whatever the truth is. He's 6. He's already learned what it means when people say things they don't mean. Mason held her gaze. I'll come back, he said. She said nothing. That's the truth, he said. She nodded once, small and tight, the way people nod when they are accepting something they are not yet sure they can afford. He went back to his bike. He sat on it. He looked at the house for a moment, the fixed fence, the front porch with its one cracked step that he was now aware of and would come back for, the window of Eli's room on the 2nd floor where the edge of a motorcycle poster was visible through the glass. He started the bike. He had not told Rachel yet. He had not found the right moment, and he wasn't sure the right moment existed, but there was something he knew about Michael Parker's accident, something that had been in the back of his mind since Rachel said 14 months ago, and gave him the date, the specific date, and he'd started doing math that he hadn't wanted to do. Because 14 months ago, on a section of Highway 12 outside Coopersville, there had been a car accident, a bad one. And Mason knew because he had been there, not in the accident, but on the roadside afterward, first to stop, the one who'd stayed until the ambulance came and held a dying man's hand in the dark, while the trucks went by and the man said things that people say when they know they're at the edge of themselves and there's only one more person left to tell. He hadn't known the man's name. He hadn't looked it up afterward because looking it up would have been a way of carrying it that he wasn't sure he was equipped to carry. Michael Parker. The man on the roadside had held his hand and said, "Tell my wife I was happy. Tell her Eli is going to be fine. He's going to be better than fine." Mason hadn't known how to tell a wife he didn't know. He hadn't known how to find her. Now he knew, and he was sitting outside her house with a fixed fence behind him, and a child inside who had his dead father's eyes, and he had no idea what to do with any of it. No idea what it meant that the universe had assembled these particular pieces in this particular order. No idea whether telling Rachel the truth would be a gift or a wound, whether she would see it the way he was starting to see it, as something that rhymed, that completed a circle, or whether it would be too much, whether he was too much. He rode home. He sat in his kitchen again. He did not drink the water again. He thought about a man's hand in the dark and a voice saying, "Tell her I was happy." He was still sitting there at midnight when his phone lit up with a message from a number he'd only recently added to his contacts. It was short. It said, "Eli is asking if the motorcycle man is coming back tomorrow. I told him I didn't know. He says to tell you he'll be up early. He wakes up at 5:30. I thought you should know what you're agreeing to." Mason looked at the message for a long time. He thought about a hand pressed flat against dark glass. He thought about the specific weight of a small child who had decided to trust the first person who showed up. He typed back, "Tell him I'll be there at 6. Then he set his phone down and sat in the dark kitchen and thought about a man named Michael Parker who had stopped for a stranger on a roadside, and what a decision like that sends out into the world and how long it takes before the world sends something back. He had no idea yet how much was still coming. And 3 miles across Coopersville, in an apartment with walls thin enough to hear the neighbor's television, a man named Derek Lowe was looking at a news story on his phone about a child rescued from a hot car at a Sunway gas station by a local biker, and he was reading about Rachel Parker, and he was thinking about the fact that she hadn't returned any of his calls in 5 weeks, and something behind his eyes went very, very still. Mason was at Rachel's door at 6:02 in the morning. He'd been parked on the street since 5:58, sitting on his bike in the pre-dawn gray with the engine off and his hands on his thighs and the specific silence of a neighborhood not yet awake around him. He'd sat there for 4 minutes doing nothing, which was not like him. Mason Mercer did not sit and do nothing. He assessed, he planned, he acted, he moved. Sitting in the gray quiet outside a woman's house with his stomach doing something unfamiliar was not a mode he had practice with. At 6:02, he got off the bike. The front porch light was already on. That meant someone had been up before him, which meant the message had been delivered and taken seriously, which meant he was expected, which meant walking up to that door was a thing he had already agreed to, and there was no renegotiating it on the porch step at 6 in the morning. He knocked. 3 knocks. Not soft. The door opened in under 10 seconds, which was fast enough that Eli had clearly been standing behind it waiting. He was in pajamas, blue, with small rocket ships on them, and his hair was doing 3 different things, and he was holding the die-cast motorcycle in both hands like evidence. "You came," Eli said. "Said I would." Eli considered this. Then he stepped back to let Mason in, with the gravity of a 6-year-old performing hospitality, and Mason stepped over the threshold of Rachel Parker's house for the second time, and the door closed behind him. Rachel was in the kitchen. She was in the same posture he'd already begun to associate with her, standing, moving, doing 2 things at once. But she had made an effort that morning that she probably hadn't intended to be visible. Her hair was down instead of pulled back. She'd put on a real shirt instead of whatever she'd slept in. She was pouring coffee with her back to him, and she said, without turning, "He was up at 5:15. I want you to know that." "Noted. He told me he needed to be ready." "Ready for what?" She turned then. She handed him a mug. "I was hoping you'd know," she said. He didn't, but Eli knew, because Eli had a plan, which he explained in the specific rapid-fire way of children who have been awake for an hour working out the logistics of something. The plan involved Mason explaining exactly how a motorcycle engine worked, starting from the beginning, which Eli defined as the very beginning, which apparently meant before motorcycles existed. Mason sat at Rachel's kitchen table and drank her coffee, which was, again, notably good, and he made a mental note about this because small comforts were things worth cataloging. And he explained combustion to a 6-year-old at 6 in the morning with Rachel moving around the kitchen behind him, making eggs she hadn't offered to make but was making anyway. And the morning light came through the window at a low angle and caught the dust motes above the table and made them look like something deliberate. It was the most normal 2 hours Mason had spent in a long time. That was the thing that scared him. He left at 8:15 because Rachel had a shift and Eli had summer program and the morning had to end. Things had to move. The world had its own schedule regardless of what was happening at a kitchen table in Coopersville. He walked to his bike and Eli stood on the porch railing, Rachel's hand at his back, keeping him from tipping, and watched him go. "Will you come back?" Eli called. "Yeah," Mason said, not looking back. His voice came out steady. He was good at that. He rode to the garage. Dozer was already there. So were 2 others. Rex Tamblyn, called Rex for the obvious reasons, and for his tendency to walk into rooms as though the rooms had been expecting him, a 38-year-old former Marine with a prosthetic left hand that he could make function better than most people's real ones, and Carver, whose full name was James Carver Holloway, but who hadn't gone by James in 20 years, a quiet black man of 51, who had done 2 tours in Iraq and come home to become the most precise mechanic Mason had ever watched work. Carver didn't talk much. When he talked, it mattered. The 4 of them represented, in the casual arithmetic of the chapter's morning, the inner working of the Iron Covenant's Coopersville presence. The other 8 members existed and functioned, and Mason knew each of them with the completeness that only comes from having been in difficult places with people. But these 3 were the ones whose counsel meant something to him in the specific way that very few things did. Dozer looked up when Mason came in. "How's the kid?" "Good." "And the mother?" "Working 2 jobs." Dozer set down his wrench. He picked up his coffee. The terrible garage coffee, which Mason now noticed with new context, and he leaned against the workbench and looked at Mason with the expression of a man who was doing arithmetic. "You fixed the fence," he said. "We talked about this." "We didn't finish talking about it." Rex looked up from the carburetor he was cleaning. He had a way of being interested in conversations without seeming interested that Mason had long since stopped being fooled by. Carver continued working, but his hands slowed by about 15%, which was Carver's version of leaning forward. "It was a falling down fence," Mason said. "Right," Dozer said. "And the toy motorcycle?" "It was $4. And you've been back twice." "3 times, Rex said, not looking up. "Mikey Yuntz drives past that street on his way to work." Mason looked at Rex. Rex polished the carburetor with complete serenity. "What are we doing here?" Dozer said. Not accusing, genuinely asking, in the way of a man who needs to understand the shape of something before he decides how to stand next to it. Mason was quiet for a moment. He pulled a stool from under the workbench and sat on it, and picked up a rag and turned it over in his hands, because having something to hold made the words come easier. "She's got a 6-year-old boy," Mason said. "Lost his father 14 months ago. She's working 2 jobs and the house is starting to go. Fence, gutters need clearing. One of the porch steps is cracked through. She's doing everything by herself, and she's doing it without complaining, and the kid is—" He stopped. He turned the rag over again. "The kid is doing okay. Better than okay. But he's got a hole in him the shape of his father, and he's 6 years old, and he is absolutely aware of it." Nobody said anything. "I know her husband," Mason said. Then, correcting, "I knew him. I didn't know I knew him until she told me his name." That shifted the air in the garage. Carver's hand stopped entirely. "What do you mean you knew him?" Dozer said. "Highway 12, 14 months ago. The accident I stopped at." The silence that followed was specific. It was the silence of men who understood exactly what Mason was describing without needing it described. The particular kind of thing that follows a man, that sits behind his eyes in the dark, that doesn't go away because there is nothing to go away. You stop at an accident because you stop at accidents. You do what you can do. And then the ambulance comes and takes what's left, and you ride home. And that's the end, except it isn't. It's just the part where the thing stops being visible. "She doesn't know," Dozer said. "She doesn't know." "You gonna tell her?" Mason looked at the rag in his hands. "I don't know when, I don't know how, but yes, I'm going to tell her." Dozer was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. The same small, tight nod that was an acknowledgement and not an endorsement, the nod of a man who accepts the shape of something he would have preferred to be shaped differently. "What do you need?" he said. That was the thing about the Iron Covenant. Nobody asked whether something should be done. If Mason said something needed doing, the question was logistics. "Nothing yet," Mason said. I'm figuring it out." Rex set down the carburetor. He looked at Mason with the direct, assessing look that was the reason his nickname stuck. "She know about the chapter? What we are?" "She knows the patch. Her husband had connections in the community." "That's not what I asked." Mason met Rex's eyes. "She knows enough." "People hear Iron Covenant and they think things," Rex said. Not defensively, just accurately. They did think things. The chapter had history, yet not criminal history, not the kind that showed up in records, but the kind that showed up in reputation, in the specific posture people adopted when they saw the patch, in the way certain law enforcement officers watched them at gas stations and roadside diners. They were not clean, exactly. They had done things in the years since coming home that occupied a gray space between the law and what the law couldn't reach, and that gray space had occasionally produced outcomes that Mason did not regret but did not advertise. "I know what people think," Mason said. "Then make sure she's not going to find out from the wrong direction," Rex said. It was the most Rex had said in a single conversation in probably 3 weeks. Mason noted that. He worked through the morning. He worked on a '98 Electra Glide that belonged to a man named Pete Sorrell, who was 71 years old and had ridden for 50 of those years, and treated the bike with the reverence of someone for whom it represented the last moving piece of a life that had gotten smaller and quieter in ways he didn't discuss. Mason liked working on Pete's bike because Pete never hovered and never second-guessed and trusted Mason completely. And trust was a thing Mason held carefully because he knew the weight of it. Around noon, Carver appeared beside him with 2 mugs of the terrible coffee and set one on the workbench and said, "You should tell her soon." Mason looked at him. "The longer you hold it," Carver said, "the more it becomes a thing you were hiding." Then Carver walked back to his own station, and that was the end of that conversation. And Mason drank the terrible coffee and thought about the phrase, "a thing you were hiding," for the rest of the afternoon. The thing about Rachel Parker's life was that it ran on a schedule so precise it was nearly military, and it ran on that schedule because it had to. There was no slack in it, no buffer days, no financial cushion that would absorb a sick day or a car problem or a school closure without significant reorganization. She worked mornings at a medical billing office, 8 to 1, precise, and then did pickup and transition and dropped Eli at her neighbor Helen's house and drove to the second job, which was 4 hours of waitressing at a mid-tier steakhouse called Caulfield's, where the tips were inconsistent, and the manager, a man named Gary Pittock, had the specific personality of a person who had been given small authority and learned to make it feel large. Mason learned the shape of her schedule the way he learned most things, by paying attention without announcing he was paying attention. On a Thursday morning, 11 days after the gas station, he drove past Caulfield's at the end of her shift. He told himself he was on his way somewhere else. He was not on his way somewhere else. He parked across the street and 2 spots down, and he watched her come out the staff entrance at 9:17 p.m. in her waitress uniform. Black shirt, black pants, hair pulled back tight now in the way it hadn't been that morning at her kitchen table. And he watched her walk to her car, a 2014 Honda CR-V with a dent in the rear quarter panel, and he watched her sit in the driver's seat for almost 3 full minutes before she started the engine. 3 minutes, just sitting. Not on her phone, not adjusting anything, just sitting in a parked car in a steakhouse lot at 9:17 p.m. He'd sat in enough parked vehicles himself to know what that was. That was a person using the last 3 private minutes of the day to be no one for just a moment before they had to go home and be someone again. He did not go over. He drove away. That same night, at 11:40, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered because he answered unknown numbers on the principle that unrecognized calls were rarely good news, and ignoring them made them worse. "Is this Mason Mercer?" Not a question. A male voice, mid-30s, with the particular flatness of someone trying to sound more relaxed than they were. "Depends on who's calling." "My name's Derek Lowe. I'm a friend of Rachel Parker's." Mason said nothing. I saw you in the news story, Derek Lowe said, about the kid at the gas station. I saw your name and I thought I should reach out. Why? A pause. The pause of someone who had planned several things to say and was now recalculating. I just wanted to touch base. Man to man, Rachel's been through a lot and I care about her. I wanted to know your intentions. My intentions. Toward her and the boy. Mason processed this. He processed the phrase man to man, which was doing a specific kind of work in the sentence. He processed, I care about her, in the way it sat in the mouth of a man who had felt the need to make this call at 11:40 p.m. to a stranger's phone. How do you know Rachel? Mason said. Another pause. We dated. We were together for about 8 months after Michael passed. And now? We're on a break. Does Rachel know that? The silence on the other end was different from the previous pauses. It was the silence of a man recalibrating around something that had landed differently than expected. She just needs some space, Derek said. She gets overwhelmed. She pushes people away. That's her business. I'm not... Derek stopped. When he continued, his voice had something different in it. Still controlled, still the performance of relaxed, but with a thread underneath it that was not relaxed at all. I'm just asking you to be careful. With the kid especially. He gets attached. It happens fast, and then when things change, he takes it hard. I know from experience. That sounds like advice. It is. I didn't ask for it. The thread tightened. Look, man, I heard what you said, Mason said. I'm going to say something back. Are you ready? A beat. Don't call this number again, Mason said. He hung up. He sat in the dark for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he set it down very carefully on the table, which was the thing he did instead of the thing he felt like doing. Derek Lowe, we're on a break. Watching the news story. Making calls at midnight to a man he'd never met. The specific possessiveness of my intentions dressed up as concern. Mason had a particular sensitivity to certain types of men, had developed it over years and in specific circumstances. And what he'd heard in that call was registering on it. He called Dozer. Dozer answered on the second ring because Dozer was a man who slept light and kept his phone on, a habit that had preceded his military service and was unlikely to change before he died. Derek Lowe, Mason said. Coopersville. I want to know what you can find. That the ex? Says they're on a break. Dozer was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I'll ask around, he said. Tonight? I'll ask around now. Yes. What Dozer found did not take long because Coopersville was not a large place, and the Iron Covenant had been part of the fabric of it for long enough that certain kinds of information moved through certain channels with predictable speed. Derek Lowe, 37, managed a commercial landscaping operation he'd inherited from his father. Moderate income, moderate standing, moderate everything. 2 prior girlfriends who had filed for protective orders and then withdrawn them. One incident at a bar called the Rusty Nail involving property damage and a verbal altercation that had been resolved without charges through the specific mechanism of the other party deciding not to press them. A reputation in certain circles as a man who was very charming for the first several months of a relationship and then less charming in ways that accelerated. The protective orders. Mason read the information Dozer had texted him, brief, factual, assembled from the specific network of people who know things in small cities, and he read it twice, and then he set his phone face down on the table. He thought about Rachel sitting in the parking lot for 3 minutes. He thought about she pushes people away. He thought about a woman working 2 jobs with a hole in her fence and a 6-year-old who woke up at 5:15 and a pile of bills on the counter and the photograph of Michael Parker on the refrigerator, and the look on her face when she'd handed Mason coffee that morning like it was something she was glad to do. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. He didn't expect to. The next morning was a Saturday, and Mason showed up at 9 with a box of pastries from a bakery he'd driven 20 minutes out of his way for because something in him registered that this was not a coffee-only morning and that small, specific gestures mattered in ways that grand ones didn't. Eli opened the door. He was in different pajamas today, green, with dinosaurs. His hair was doing the same general 3 things. You brought food, he said. Observant, Mason said. Mama says I notice things. She's right. Eli stepped back to let him in, and then led him to the kitchen where Rachel was standing at the counter with a mug and the expression of a woman who had slept approximately the same amount Mason had. She looked at the bakery box. She looked at Mason. She opened her mouth. I drove past it, Mason said. Of course you did. On my way here. It's in the opposite direction. Stores move. Something happened in her face that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. They ate at the kitchen table. Eli ate a croissant with the focused methodology of a person consuming something very seriously. Rachel had a Danish and the rest of her coffee. Mason drank coffee he didn't taste because he was thinking about how to say what he needed to say and how it would land and what the right morning for it was and whether this was the right morning. Derek called me, he said. Rachel's mug stopped halfway to her mouth. He called my cell, Mason said. Last night. She set the mug down. She was very still for a moment. Then she looked at Eli, who was engaged with the croissant and apparently not tracking. Eli, baby, can you go watch something in the living room for a few minutes? Eli went without argument, which suggested he was attuned to the tone even if not the content. Rachel waited until she heard the television. She was looking at the table. He found your number. Apparently. What did he say? He said he was concerned about my intentions toward you and Eli. She was quiet. He said you're on a break, Mason said. She looked up then. Her eyes did something complicated. I ended it in April, she said. I told him I was done. I said it clearly. He has a different interpretation of clearly. I know about the protective orders, Mason said. He said it simply, without softness, because softening it would be a way of suggesting she needed softness, and he didn't believe she did. She held his gaze. She didn't flinch. How? I asked someone who asks around. Your chapter. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the television played something with cartoon sound effects. The morning light was doing the same thing it had done before, coming through the kitchen window at a low angle, unhurried. They were dropped, she said finally. I know. I dropped them. I know that too. It's complicated. When you have a kid and you're the only one holding things together and you don't know if... She stopped. She was pressing her thumbnail into the side of her mug, an unconscious pressure. He was very sorry. He was always very sorry afterward. Mason said nothing. He let the statement exist without filling the silence around it. I handled it, Rachel said. I know you did. I don't need... I'm not offering anything, Mason said. I'm just telling you he called me. Because you should know. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. There was something in the exchange that was not romantic. Not yet. Not something either of them was prepared to name. It was more fundamental than that. It was the look of two people who were beginning to take the full measure of each other and finding that the measurement was not frightening. Thank you, she said. He's going to keep trying, Mason said. That's my read on it. She nodded once. Probably. You have people around you if that gets complicated. What people? Mason held her gaze. Us, he said. She was very still. I'm not a service, he said. And my chapter doesn't operate like a service. But if something happens, or if he shows up somewhere he shouldn't, you call me. That's not a complicated thing. It's just what you do. Rachel looked at him for a long time. She was working something out. He could see the working out of it moving behind her eyes, the specific internal negotiation of a woman who had learned to function without asking for things, and was now being offered something she didn't have a filing system for. Okay, she said finally. Okay. But I'm not... She stopped, started again. I'm not someone who needs to be rescued. I know. I mean it. I've been handling things a long time. I can see that. She looked at him. You can. Yes. Another of those long, quiet moments between them, dense with things that weren't being said but weren't being denied either. Then Eli's voice came from the living room. Mama, there's a motorcycle on TV. And the moment ended the way moments do, not badly, just absorbed into the larger current of a morning that still had time in it. Mason stayed until noon. The chapter meeting happened on Sunday, which was when they always met, not in any formal sense, but in the organic way of men who operated from habit. Sunday mornings, the back room of a bar called Hester's on the industrial side of town, coffee and eggs, and the particular ease of people who don't perform anything for each other. Mason arrived and there were 7 of them today. Dozer, Rex, Carver, a man called Speck, thin, weathered, former Navy, the chapter's most reliable source of calm in situations that called for the opposite. Yuntz, Mikey Yuntz from the gas station story. A younger member, 28 years old, called Truck, who had been with the chapter for 2 years and had lost his hearing in one ear to an IED in 2019 and wore his hair long on that side now as an unspoken accommodation. And an older man, 63, who was called Sergeant, even though the rank he'd actually held was different. He was the nearest thing the chapter had to a de facto elder, and he occupied that role with the absolute calm of a man who had outlived nearly every crisis he'd encountered. Mason told them about Derek Lowe. He didn't editorialize. He presented the information in the way he'd learned to present intelligence, factually, sequentially, with the relevant details and without the irrelevant ones. When he finished, there was the specific silence of 7 men processing. "Protective orders withdrawn," Sergeant said. "Both." "Under what circumstance?" "Unknown." Sergeant nodded slowly. He was stirring his coffee, though he hadn't added anything to it. The pattern on that type is usually escalation when the external variable changes. Someone new in the picture. "That's my read," Mason said. "What's the external variable?" Dozer said, and it wasn't really a question. "Me," Mason said. Nobody said anything for a moment. "You want someone keeping an eye on the street," Rex said. "Not yet. I don't want her to know she's being watched. She's not—" Mason stopped. "She's not a situation. She's a person who has enough complications without adding surveillance to her morning." "Sensible," Sergeant said. "But if he shows up," Mason said, "I want to know." "Mikey drives past anyway," Yuntz said. "I can vary my timing." Mason looked at him. Yuntz shrugged. It was not a big thing. It was the kind of not big thing the chapter did constantly. Small adjustments in routes and schedules and habits that added up to a presence without being a presence. Nobody organized it or announced it. It simply happened, the way things simply happened when the right people were paying attention. "There's something else," Mason said. He told them about the highway, about Michael Parker, about the night on the roadside and what Michael had said and what Mason had been unable to do with it after. He watched their faces as he told it, watched the information land in each of them differently, but with the same weight. Dozer, who already knew, looked at the table. Carver looked at Mason steadily. Sergeant set down his coffee spoon. "She doesn't know," Sergeant said. "No." "You're going to tell her?" "Yes." "When?" "I don't know yet. It has to be right. It can't be something that blindsides her in the middle of everything else that's happening." Sergeant looked at him for a long moment. He had the eyes of a man who had witnessed many things and made peace with the complexity of most of them. "When you tell her," he said, "make sure she understands that it changes nothing about why you're here, because it will be easy for her to think it's the reason, that you're here because of the debt. It's not the reason. I know that. She needs to know it too." Mason looked at his coffee. He had not touched it. It had gone cold. "What if she doesn't believe me?" "That's her right," Sergeant said. "Wouldn't make her wrong to be uncertain." Truck cleared his throat from the end of the table. He did that when he had something to say that he wasn't sure he had standing to say. "The kid," he said. "How's the kid doing with all this?" "Better every week," Mason said. He stopped. He wasn't expecting the thing that moved through him when he thought about Eli, which was something between fondness and protectiveness, and something else he didn't have a clean name for. "He's a good kid, smart, missing something, but handling it." Truck nodded. He looked at his plate. He said very quietly, "I was 5 when my dad left. Not dead. Just left." He paused. "Someone should have showed up." Nobody responded to that because it didn't need a response. It sat in the room with everyone, and everyone let it sit. After the meeting broke, Dozer fell in beside Mason, walking to the lot. "Carver and I were thinking," Dozer said. "Were you?" The gutters you mentioned, and the porch step. I was just noting, we've got nothing Sunday afternoon. Mason was quiet. And Speck mentioned the roof of that neighborhood generally takes a beating in summer, Dozer said. Might be worth checking the flashing. Mason looked at him. We're just two guys who are already going to be near that street, Dozer said, with complete serenity. 3, said Carver from 5 feet behind them, without looking up from locking his bike. Mason stood in the parking lot of Hester's bar in the Sunday morning light and looked at 2 men who he had known long enough that he no longer had to explain things to them, and he felt the particular kind of gratitude that has no comfortable way to be expressed and so becomes silence instead. She'll want to feed you, Mason said. She feeds people. Good, Dozer said. Carver eats 4 times what a normal person eats. It's a condition. I burn more, Carver said serenely. They came on a Wednesday, which was Rachel's day off from the billing office. Mason had told her only that 2 people from his chapter wanted to take a look at her gutters. He'd told her this simply, without ceremony, on the Monday before, sitting on her porch with Eli in the yard and a coffee going cold beside him. Rachel had looked at him with the expression she sometimes got, measured, guarded, the specific defense mechanism of a person who has learned that offers come with costs. Why, she said, gutters need looking at. I can call someone. You can. Or you can let Dozer and Carver look at them for free because they like having something to do. She was quiet. They're not collecting anything, Mason said. There's no bill at the end. They want to do it. It's how they're put together. She looked out at the yard where Eli was pushing a toy truck along the sidewalk. People like that, she said, not quite to him, make me suspicious. You should be suspicious, Mason said. As a general practice, these 2 specifically, you can trust. She'd agreed in the end, the way she agreed to most things. Not warmly, not easily, but with the directness of a woman who calculated the math of a situation and made a decision about it. The calculation seemed to have landed in their favor. Dozer and Carver arrived at 9 on Wednesday morning in Dozer's truck, tools in the bed, coffee in hand, the general air of men who had done this kind of thing before and had no need to make it significant. They introduced themselves on the porch with the economy of men not accustomed to introductions. Dozer said his name. Carver said his. Eli stared at Dozer with the focused attention of a child encountering someone significantly larger than expected. You're big, Eli said. I've been told, Dozer said. Are you a motorcycle man too? I am. Eli processed this. Do you know Mason? Long time. He fixed our fence, Eli said, with the proprietary pride of someone reporting a fact of significance. He mentioned that, Dozer said. He also brought me a motorcycle, a toy one. It's in my room. That sounds like him, Dozer said, with a gravity that Eli seemed to find appropriate. Rachel watched this exchange from the doorway with an expression Mason couldn't fully decode. It was something in the vicinity of surprised but deeper, like a person watching evidence accumulate for a conclusion they'd been trying to resist. Dozer and Carver worked through the morning. The gutters were worse than Mason had estimated, blocked solid along the back stretch, pulling away from the fascia on the north side, with water damage behind the joint that had started to work its way into the wood. Carver found it first and called Dozer over, and they had a brief, quiet conversation about it that involved no drama and a trip to the hardware store at 11 for additional materials. Rachel made lunch. She did it without asking whether anyone wanted it, which was the particular hospitality of a woman who expressed care through action rather than inquiry. She made sandwiches, good ones, substantial, with the kind of effort that was invisible but detectable, and brought them outside on a tray and set them on the porch railing. Dozer ate 2. Carver ate 3.5, which Rachel watched with an expression of pure surprise. He burns more, Mason said. Apparently, Rachel said. They sat on the porch for 40 minutes. Eli sat next to Dozer, which he had decided was his position, and told Dozer about motorcycles with the same comprehensive energy he'd deployed on Mason. Dozer listened with the same quality of attention that Mason had, actually listened, tracked it, asked follow-up questions, and Eli bloomed under it in the specific way of children whose ideas are taken seriously. Rachel watched her son with Dozer and Carver and Mason, and something moved across her face that she didn't hide because she didn't seem to notice it moving. It was a complicated thing. It was not simple happiness. It was the expression of a woman encountering something she had stopped letting herself want, and finding that it was harder to keep not wanting it than she'd thought. She went inside to get more coffee. Mason followed, because the coffee was a pretext. She was standing at the counter with her back to him, hands flat on the surface, not making coffee. He could see her shoulder blades moving with her breathing. "They're good men," she said. "Yes." I wasn't prepared for that. She turned, her eyes were dry, she made sure of that. I wasn't prepared for any of this. I know. She looked at him. "What do you want from us, Mason? I need you to tell me, because Eli is—" She stopped. "He comes home from summer program, and the first thing he asks is whether you're coming, and I need to understand what this is." Mason was quiet for a moment. He looked at the photograph on the refrigerator. Michael Parker with his helmet and his smile. "I want to be here," Mason said. "That's it. I don't have a plan behind it. I don't want anything from it. I just—" He stopped, restarted. "When I fixed that fence, it wasn't strategy. It was just something that needed fixing, and I could fix it. And when I come here and drink your coffee and listen to Eli talk about compression ratios, it's because—" He stopped again. "Because what?" Rachel said. "Because it's the most real thing I've been inside in a long time," Mason said. She held his gaze. She was very still. "And I know that's not nothing," he said. "I know it's complicated. And I know you've been taking care of things alone long enough that having someone offer to show up feels like a trap. I'm not asking you to trust me on faith. I'm just asking you to let me show up." Rachel looked at him for a long time. Outside, Dozer's laugh, a large, unpracticed sound, the laugh of a man who laughs rarely enough that it arrives unexpectedly, came through the window, and Eli's answering laugh came with it, high and unguarded and completely free. "Okay," Rachel said. "Okay." She turned back to the counter and actually made the coffee this time, and Mason stood in her kitchen and listened to his chapter brother laugh with her son in the afternoon, and something in his chest did something he hadn't cleared for. It was 3 days later that everything began to break. Mason was at the garage when Yuntz pulled in faster than usual. Yuntz was not a fast-moving man. He operated on a steady, deliberate frequency that rarely varied. He was varying now. "Derek Lowe," Yuntz said, coming through the door. "He was on Rachel's street this morning, sitting in his car, for about 40 minutes. Mason set down the wrench in his hand. "He didn't get out," Yuntz said. "He just sat. Then he drove away." The garage was quiet. Dozer stood up from the bike he'd been working on. Carver's hand stopped. "Did she see him?" Mason said. "Don't know. The lights in the house were on." Mason picked up his phone. He called Rachel. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. "She's at the billing office," he said. "Eli's at summer program," Yuntz said. Mason was already reaching for his jacket. "I'll call her at lunch." He looked at Dozer. "I want someone on that street." "Done," Dozer said. "Not obvious." "When are we obvious?" Mason put on his jacket. He stood in the middle of the garage for a moment, not moving, running the variables in the specific way he ran variables, rapidly, practically, without letting them become emotional before they needed to be. Derek Lowe sitting outside Rachel's house for 40 minutes. Not knocking, not calling, just sitting. That was the part that bothered Mason most, and it bothered him for a reason he understood from training and from a kind of pattern recognition that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with having paid close attention to human behavior in situations where the stakes of misreading it were very high. Men who sat outside didn't do it without a reason. Men who sat outside were working something up too. He called Rachel again at 12:15, when her lunch break would have started. She picked up on the second ring this time, slightly breathless in the way of someone who had been moving. "Hey," she said. "Hey, you have a minute?" "Yeah, I'm in the car. What's wrong?" He hadn't said anything was wrong. She'd heard it anyway, in whatever she'd already learned to read from his voice. He filed that. "Derek was on your street this morning," Mason said, "parked outside. About 40 minutes. Silence. "He didn't come to the door," Mason said. He drove away. The silence stretched. He could hear her breathing, slightly unsteady. Okay, she said finally. He's escalating the pattern. I think you should know. I know, she said. Her voice had gone flat in the specific way that was not calm, but performed calm. I know how this goes. Has he done this before? A pause. Yes. Okay, Mason said. I want you to tell me if he contacts you directly, any form. I don't want to make this a... Rachel. She stopped. You've been handling things alone for a long time, he said. I know. But this is the specific situation where handling it alone is the wrong call. Tell me if he contacts you. Another pause. When she spoke again, something in her voice had shifted. Not broken, not soft, but different in some way that suggested she'd put something down that she'd been holding for a while. He sent 6 texts last Tuesday, she said. I didn't mention it because I didn't want to. I didn't want to make you feel like you had to... Rachel. Yeah. This is not a burden, Mason said. This is just what comes next, okay? The silence on her end was the silence of someone accepting something. Okay, she said. He hung up. He stood in the parking lot of the billing office that he'd driven to without making a clear decision to drive to it while she was on her lunch break inside. He sat on his bike with the engine off. 6 texts last Tuesday. He called Dozer. Level 2, he said. Dozer knew what that meant. He was about to start the bike when a car pulled into the lot and parked 3 spaces away, and Derek Lowe got out of it. Mason had never seen him in person, but he would have known him anyway, from the news story where Mason had been photographed carrying Eli at the gas station, which Derek had clearly studied enough to recognize Mason's bike on sight, because Derek looked at the Road King first, and then looked at Mason with the expression of a man whose calculation had just changed. He was good-looking in the way that some particular type of man is good-looking, put together, even in jeans and a work shirt, with the practiced ease of someone who had spent time learning to present well. He had a smile that he deployed as he crossed the parking lot that reached his eyes just carefully enough to look genuine. Mason Mercer, he said. Mason said nothing. Derek stopped a reasonable distance away. He was doing the calculation that most people did, taking in the size, the cut, the damage on Mason's face, the specific quality of stillness that Mason had when he felt something needed to be watched. He was trying to decide what posture fit the situation. He went with friendly. I figured we'd run into each other eventually. You figured right. I don't want any trouble, Derek said. The sentence was shaped the way that sentence is shaped when the person saying it is simultaneously true and lying. Because Derek didn't want trouble in the sense that he didn't want to be in trouble, which was different from not wanting to cause it. Good, Mason said. I just care about Rachel and Eli. That's all this is. You said that on the phone. And I mean it. Mason looked at him. He looked at him the way he looked at things he was assessing. Directly, without hurry, without hostility that wasn't necessary. Rachel ended your relationship in April, he said. She told you it was over. You have a different read on that. Derek's smile adjusted by about 3 degrees. Relationships are complicated. She was clear, Mason said. I'm going to be clear too, since we're here. If she wanted you around, you'd know. She knows where to find you. The texts, the street, the phone calls to people she knows, those aren't the actions of a man who's giving someone space. They're the actions of a man who isn't listening. Derek's jaw moved. The friendly posture was doing work now, maintaining itself against a current. You've known this woman for 2 weeks. That's accurate. And you're telling me about her. I'm telling you about your behavior. Her feelings are her own. You don't know anything about what we had. I know what a protective order is, Mason said. I know what 2 of them means. The friendly posture gave out. What replaced it was something Mason had seen before. The specific shift in a man's face when the performance drops and the thing underneath shows itself. It was not violence. Not yet. It was the precursor to violence, which is the decision that violence is now a legitimate option. Mason watched it happen with the same detached precision he brought to everything that required precision, and he didn't move. You want to be very careful, Derek said quietly. I'm always careful, Mason said. They looked at each other. The parking lot was still around them. 15 seconds of it, maybe 20. Then Derek turned and walked back to his car and got in and drove away, and Mason watched the car until he couldn't see it anymore. He sat on his bike. He was completely still. His hands were steady. They were always steady in the moment. He thought about Rachel's voice saying, "He sent 6 texts last Tuesday." He thought about the particular resignation in it, the exhaustion of someone who already knew the pattern and had stopped being surprised by it. He thought about what Sargent had said months back about escalation when the external variable changes. He was the external variable. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't have saved. He opened it. The text said, "I know what you did on Highway 12. I know you were with Michael Parker when he died. Does Rachel know that? Because I think she'd want to." Mason read it twice. He set his phone face down on the tank. He sat in the parking lot and breathed with complete control and thought about every decision that had been made in the last 2 weeks and what each of them had set in motion. And he thought about Rachel's face when she said, "I don't need to be rescued." And he thought about Eli's eyes looking up at him from the gas station asphalt. And he thought about a man's hand in the dark on a roadside and the words, "Tell her I was happy." He had been going to tell her himself, on his own terms. In the right moment, that option was closing. Derek Lowe had just handed him a deadline that wasn't his to give, and the only way to outrun it was to get there first, to tell Rachel the truth before Derek weaponized it, to walk into her kitchen before she got a version of this from a man who would frame it as a secret and a betrayal. He had hours, maybe, not days. He picked up his phone. He started to call her, and then his phone rang first, not Rachel, not Dozer, but a number he recognized as the school's summer program. And when he answered, the voice on the other end was young, female, and frightened. "Mr. Mercer, we have Eli as an emergency contact. There's been an incident. Eli is okay, but there's a man at the front gate saying he's family, and Eli is upset, and we can't reach his mother. Can you come?" Mason was already moving. He had the phone to his ear and his helmet in his other hand, and he was off the bike and walking before he processed the full sentence, operating on the part that mattered. Eli is upset, and a man at the front gate and can't reach his mother. The rest was noise. The operational picture was clear enough. "I'm coming," he said. "Don't let that man through the gate. Don't let Eli leave the building. I'm 10 minutes out." "He's saying he's the boy's uncle. He's not. I'm 10 minutes out. Lock the front entrance." He hung up. He called Dozer with one hand while starting the bike with the other, which was a thing he could do and which he did now without thinking about it. "Summer program on Aldine Street," Mason said when Dozer picked up. "Derek Lowe is at the gate. I need you there." 5 minutes, Dozer said. He called Rachel while he rode. She picked up on the first ring this time, which meant she'd been holding the phone. "Something happened at the program," Mason said. He kept his voice level because panic in a voice traveled and he needed her functional. "Eli is fine. He's inside and safe. Derek showed up at the gate claiming to be family." The sound she made was not a word. "I'm on my way there now," Mason said. "You need to drive there. Don't speed. He's okay, Rachel. He's inside." "I'm leaving now, she. Drive safe. He's okay." He rode. The summer program occupied a converted elementary school on Aldine Street, a wide one-story building behind a chain-link fence with a gate that required a code or a staff member to open. When Mason pulled into the parking lot, the gate was closed, and there was a man standing outside it, Derek Lowe, in the same jeans and work shirt from the billing office lot, arms crossed, with the posture of someone who had been waiting long enough to be irritated about it. Dozer's truck was already there. Dozer was standing 12 feet from Derek, with his arms at his sides and the specific quality of stillness that large men develop when they have learned that stillness is more effective than motion. Mason parked. He walked to the gate. A staff member, young woman, 20s, visibly stressed, was on the inside of the fence. She had Eli beside her, her hand on his shoulder. Eli was not crying. He was looking at Derek with the careful, shuttered expression of a child who has learned to go very still when something is wrong. When Eli saw Mason, the stillness broke, not into crying, into something more specific, the specific collapse of maintained composure that happens when the person you've been waiting for finally appears. "Mason," Eli said. "Hey, buddy." Mason kept the fence between them for now. He looked at the staff member. "Is he hurt?" "No, he's upset. He didn't want to go." "Good." He looked at Eli. "Stay inside for a minute, okay? I'll come get you in 1 minute." Eli looked at Derek, then back at Mason. He nodded and went with the staff member, and Mason turned to Derek. Derek was watching him with the expression from the parking lot, the one beneath the performance. "I have every right to be here," Derek said. "You're not family," Mason said. "I've known that boy for 8 months. I was in that house." "You're not on his emergency contact list," Mason said. "You have no legal standing here. The staff called me, not you. Because Rachel has you playing daddy." "Hey!" Dozer's voice. Not loud, just present, the way Dozer's voice was present when it needed to be. Derek looked at Dozer. He recalibrated. He was doing the math of the situation. 2 of them, the gate, the staff member who was now on a phone inside, the parking lot with its visibility. He was not a stupid man. He understood the math. "I'm going to talk to Rachel," Derek said. "That's her choice to make," Mason said. "I'm going to tell her what I know." "Tell her whatever you want," Mason said. "I'm going to tell her first." Something shifted in Derek's face. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected defensiveness, evasion, the behavior of a man protecting a secret. He got instead the flat certainty of a man who had already made his decision. "You think that helps you?" Derek said. "I think it's the right thing," Mason said. "And I think you don't know what that feels like, which is why you're standing outside a children's program at noon on a Wednesday. So..." Derek's jaw set. He looked at Mason for a long moment. Then he looked at the gate and at the building beyond it, and he turned and walked to his car and got in and left. Mason watched him go. He was aware of his own breathing, steady, controlled, the body running its own discipline because it knew the moment wasn't over. Dozer came to stand beside him. "He'll come back," Dozer said. "I know. Maybe tonight. I know. What do you need?" "Eyes on the house from 5 p.m., rotating. Don't make it visible." Dozer nodded. Rachel pulled into the lot 40 seconds later. She was out of the car before it fully stopped and moving toward the gate, and Mason stepped aside to let her through, let her get to the door and to Eli, because what needed to happen in the next 30 seconds between Rachel and her son did not need him in it. He waited. Dozer waited beside him in the particular companionable silence of men who are good at waiting. After 4 minutes, Rachel came back out. She had Eli on her hip, which was technically too large for that. He was 6, he was solid. But she was carrying him anyway, and he had his face against her neck and his arms around her, and she was holding on with both hands in a way that had nothing to do with his weight. She looked at Mason. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. "Thank you," she said. "I'm going to follow you home," Mason said. "And then we need to talk. All right?" She looked at him. She read his face. She nodded once. They drove. The talk happened at her kitchen table, which was where everything happened in that house. The meals and the homework and the 6 a.m. motorcycle explanations, and now this. Eli was in the living room with the television on at a low volume, within earshot but not in the room, which Rachel had arranged deliberately. She believed in being honest with her son about the broad shape of things, even when the details were adult, because Michael had believed in that and she had inherited the practice. Mason sat across from her. He had his hands flat on the table. He had decided on the ride over that there was no version of this that was easy and therefore no point in trying to make it easy. He would just say it. "I was there," Mason said. "On Highway 12. The night Michael died." Rachel's hands, wrapped around her mug, went still. "I was the first to stop," he said. "I was with him until the ambulance came. I didn't know his name. I found out when you told me, when you said 14 months ago and gave me the date and I did the math." He let that sit for a moment. "He wasn't alone," Mason said. "He was conscious for most of it. He wasn't in significant pain in the end. I want you to know that. He talked. He said..." He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. He said to tell his wife he was happy, that Eli was going to be fine, going to be better than fine. He looked up. I didn't know how to find you. I didn't know his name. And then I did know. And I was trying to find the right way to tell you. And then Derek sent me that text, and I knew I was out of time. Rachel was very still. The kitchen around her was doing all the ordinary things kitchens do. The refrigerator hum, the faint sound of the television, the afternoon light coming through the window. And she was in the middle of it like something that had stopped. He was conscious, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Yes. He wasn't alone. No. Her eyes filled. She did not let them spill. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and looked at the table, and Mason watched her hold herself together with the same precision she brought to everything. He said he was happy, she said. Those were his words. A long silence. She turned her mug in her hands. One slow rotation, then another. Why didn't you tell me sooner, she said. Not an accusation, a genuine question. Because I didn't know how, Mason said. And because I was afraid you'd think everything I'd done here was about the debt, about owing something to Michael's family. And I need you to understand that it isn't. It was never that. She looked at him. Her eyes were doing something complex. How do I know that? You don't, Mason said. Not from words. But you've been watching me for 3 weeks. You've been watching how I am with Eli and how I show up and what I do when nobody's looking. You're not someone who misses things. What does that tell you? She was quiet for a long time. In the living room, Eli's television made a cartoon sound. Outside, the afternoon had shifted, the light going from direct to diffuse, the first suggestion of clouds. He saved your life once, Rachel said. Didn't he? Before. Mason was quiet for a moment. That's a different story, he said, for a different day. If you want to hear it. She looked at him. Is it connected? Everything seems to be connected, Mason said. I don't know what to do with that yet. She held his gaze. There was something moving in her face that was not any single emotion, but all of them passing through in sequence, the way weather moves. Grief and relief and confusion, and something that was almost anger, and something that was not quite gratitude, and something he couldn't name at all. I need some time, she said. Okay. I'm not... She stopped. I'm not pushing you away. I just need to... Rachel. He said her name quietly, just that. Take the time. It's yours. She looked at him. She nodded. He left. He sat on his bike outside and sent Dozer a text that said she knows and got back a single word. Okay. He started the bike. He rode, not toward the garage, not toward his house, but out onto the highway because sometimes the road was the only thing that could absorb the particular kind of weight that had nowhere else to go. He rode for an hour. He came back. The call came at 11:47 p.m. Mason was awake. He'd been awake since 9, sitting in his kitchen in the dark with the familiarity of a man who had spent many nights awake in kitchens and had stopped expecting sleep to arrive when he wanted it. It was Dozer. He's on the street. Mason was already standing. Moving? Parked. Engine off. Been there 12 minutes. Where's Yuntz? 2 streets over. Get him closer. I'm coming. He rode with his lights on, but his engine quieter than usual. The Road King could run low when he needed it to, and he needed it to now. He came in from the far end of Rachel's street and killed the engine half a block out and coasted the last distance and parked behind Dozer's truck. Dozer was in the cab. Mason got in the passenger side. The street was quiet. Porch lights on at 2 houses, the rest dark. Derek's car was parked across from Rachel's house and slightly back, angled so the driver's window had a direct line to Rachel's front door and Eli's second-floor window. How long now? Mason said. 22 minutes. They watched. Derek's car was dark, no dome light, no phone glow, just sitting, watching. Mason thought about Eli's shuttered face at the gate. He thought about Rachel at the kitchen table, turning her mug in her hands. He thought about 6 texts on a Tuesday and protective orders withdrawn, and she just needs some space. If he gets out of the car, Mason said. I know, Dozer said. We don't touch him, Mason said. We position, that's all. I know, Mason. They sat. The street was still. The night had cooled slightly. Not cold, not this time of year, but the specific quality of air at midnight in July that was the closest thing to relief the day could offer. Mason could hear insects. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear, faintly, the creak of Dozer shifting his weight. Derek's door opened. Both of them moved. Not fast. Fast was wrong here. Fast made noise and drew attention and changed the shape of the thing. They got out of the truck quietly, and they crossed the street at a measured pace, coming up on either side of Derek's car as Derek stood on the sidewalk looking at Rachel's house. Derek heard them. He turned. He looked at Mason. He looked at Dozer. He looked at the house. He looked back. "I'm on a public street," Derek said. "You are," Mason said. "I'm not doing anything." "You're outside a woman's house at midnight," Dozer said, "after showing up at her kid's school today." "I didn't—" "You were at the gate for 25 minutes, Mason said. "Staff have it on camera." Derek's jaw moved. "I just want to talk to her." "She knows where you are," Mason said. "If she wanted to talk, she'd call." "You've got her convinced that I'm—" "She made her own decisions," Mason said. "The same ones she made in April. The same ones the two women before her made. Some people make the same decision repeatedly when someone gives them the same reason." Derek went very still. The performance was gone entirely now. What was underneath was not explosive, not yet, but it was the thing that preceded explosion, the specific compression of a man who was running out of ways to manage what he felt. "You don't know me," Derek said. "I know enough. You think you're protecting her." Something shifted in his voice. "You think that's what this is. Big biker shows up, fixes the fence, plays daddy to the kid, and now he's the hero." He looked at Mason with the specific contempt of a man who has decided he has nothing to lose from the truth. "I know what you did. I know you were there when Michael died and didn't tell her. I'm the one who gave you the deadline. Think about that." Mason looked at him. "She knows," he said. "I told her this afternoon." A pause. "Before you could use it," Mason said. Derek looked at him. His face did something that was almost a different kind of recognition. Then it closed again. "I'll be back," he said. "That's your choice," Mason said, "and it'll have the same result." Derek got in his car. He drove away. Mason watched the taillights disappear and kept watching the empty street for a moment afterward, the way he watched exits. Dozer came to stand beside him. "He's not done," Dozer said. "No." "What's the next move?" Mason turned it over. Derek was escalating, but inside the zone of things that were still technically legal. Parking on a public street, showing up at a school gate, sending texts. The line between that zone and the other zone was not thick, and Derek had already shown he knew where the line was and how to approach it without crossing it. That was its own kind of expertise. That was the expertise of a man who had been here before. "I need to talk to Sergeant," Mason said. They rode back separately. Mason rode slow. He was thinking about Derek's face when Mason said she knows. The specific thing that had moved through it, that moment of recalculation. Derek had been holding the information about Highway 12 as leverage, as a weapon to use when the time was right, and Mason had stripped it before he could deploy it. That made Derek less powerful. It also made him less predictable. The thing about leverage was that when you lost it, some men cut their losses and withdrew. And some men set the thing on fire instead. Mason pulled into his driveway. He sat on the bike for a moment in the dark. His phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. He was here. He rang the bell. Eli woke up. Mason was back on the bike in 4 seconds. He had been at the street less than 20 minutes ago. Derek had driven away and looped back before Mason reached his own driveway. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. He'd waited for the truck and the bike to clear the street, and then he'd come back and rung the bell at midnight and woken a 6-year-old. Rachel met Mason at the door. She was in pajamas, her hair loose, and she had a look on her face that Mason had not seen before. Not fear exactly, something more specific, the look of a woman who has moved from being unsettled to being certain. Certain about what? He'd find out. He rang 3 times, she said, low, so Eli wouldn't hear from upstairs. When I looked through the window, he was standing on the porch. He saw me see him, and he just stood there for about a minute. Then he left. Eli heard the bell. He called down the stairs. I told him it was nothing. He went back to sleep. She looked at Mason. He wasn't trying to come in. He wasn't trying to force anything. He just wanted me to know he could be there whenever he chose. Mason understood that. That was the move. Not violence. A demonstration of access. I can be at your door at midnight. I can wake your son. I can be here. Okay, Mason said. I want to file a report, Rachel said. Good. Tonight if there's a way. There's a way. Get dressed. I'll call Rex. He has a contact at the department. She went upstairs. Mason called Rex, who answered on the first ring with the alertness of a man who had been awake. Rex asked 4 questions, got 4 answers, and said he'd make a call. By the time Rachel came downstairs in jeans and a jacket, there was a contact name and a shift supervisor who was expecting them. They drove to the station at 12:40 a.m. Eli slept. They left him in the car in the lit parking lot, visible from the station entrance, while Rachel gave her statement. The officer who took it was a woman in her 30s named Castillo, who had the manner of someone who had heard this particular shape of story before and did not underestimate it. She took the text, she took the gate incident, she took the midnight porch visit, she asked clear questions and wrote clear answers, and at the end she said the words that officers said, about documentation and process and what constituted actionable, and Rachel listened with the patience of a woman who knew what the words meant and what they didn't. What they didn't mean was safety. What they meant was paper. They drove back. Rachel was quiet for most of it. In the back seat, Eli slept with his face against the window and his hand loosely holding the die-cast motorcycle, even in sleep. It's not enough, Rachel said. The report. It never is until something happens. Then it's evidence. She looked out the passenger window. I know how this works. I've known for a while. Things change now, Mason said, because you're here. Because the chapter is here. She looked at him. What does that mean, practically? It means he won't be able to move near you or Eli without someone knowing. It means if he crosses a line, there will be witnesses. It means you're not alone in the space between what the report covers and what the law can actually do. She was quiet for a moment. That sounds like a lot. It's not a complicated thing, Mason said. It's just people showing up. She looked at him. She looked at Eli in the rear view. She looked at the dark street ahead of them. I told Eli tonight before bed that some good men were looking out for us. She paused. He asked if you were one of them. Mason kept his eyes on the road. I said yes, she said. He pulled up to her house. He walked her to the door. He checked the inside quickly. Standard pass, nothing dramatic, just the rooms and the windows. And then he came back out and she was standing on the porch with her arms folded against the night air, which had gone cool now. You should sleep, he said. I know. She looked at him. Mason, what you told me today, about Michael. He waited. I've been sitting with it all evening. She pressed her lips together briefly. He didn't die alone. I didn't know that. I've been thinking about that road for 14 months, and I didn't know someone was there. Something moved through her voice, but she held it. She stopped. That's not a small thing. No, Mason said. It isn't. Thank you, she said, for being there, even before I knew it was you. He looked at her. He thought about a lot of things he didn't say. Go inside, he said. Lock up. I'll be on the street until morning. She looked at him. She nodded. She went inside. He heard the locks turn. He walked back to his bike and sat on it at the curb in the dark, in the quiet of a street at 1 a.m, and he called Dozer and said alternating 4-hour shifts starting now, and Dozer said already on it, and Mason put his phone in his pocket. He sat. He was still sitting there when the text came in at 2:11 a.m. Not from Derek this time. From a number he didn't recognize with a Tennessee area code, but not one he knew. The text had no message, only a photograph. He opened it. His stomach went cold. The photograph was taken from outside the Iron Covenant garage. Night shot, long lens, clear enough. It showed the interior through the large bay window, the bikes, the workbenches, the men. It showed Dozer. It showed Carver. It showed Yuntz and Truck and Speck. It showed, in a corner of the frame, a detail that Mason stared at for a long time. In the background of the photograph, barely visible but undeniably present, were three men he did not recognize. They were standing at the far workbench looking at something, documents, it looked like, or photographs. And their posture was the posture of men in conversation with their backs deliberately to the camera's likely angle. Mason had not been in the garage tonight. Those men had not been invited to the garage. He called Dozer. Dozer answered, and Mason said only, "The garage. Right now. Don't turn on any new lights. Go in through the side." What happened? Someone's been inside. A pause. Then Dozer's voice dropped to a register Mason recognized. The register below professional, the one that was just pure, stripped-down attention. How long ago? Unknown. Maybe tonight. Maybe longer. He looked at the photograph again. The document on the workbench. The angle of the men's heads. Don't touch anything on the main bench. I mean, nothing. I hear you. And Dozer. Mason looked at the three unknown faces in the photograph, or the backs of them, the deliberate backs. Who has been in the garage in the last 2 weeks that shouldn't have been there? Silence. Dozer. There was a walk-in last Thursday, Dozer said slowly. Man said his bike had thrown a chain 2 blocks over. Carver let him in, fixed it. He was there maybe 40 minutes. Description. Dozer gave it. Average height, early 40s, brown jacket, nothing distinctive, nothing memorable, which was itself distinctive, which was itself a thing. I need Sergeant, Mason said, and I need everyone at the garage in 30 minutes. He rode. The garage on the industrial side of Coopersville looked the same from outside. Same corrugated metal, same dull overhead light at the entrance, same quiet street. But Mason had spent enough time in enough compromised spaces to know that things looked the same right up until the moment you understood they didn't. He went in the side door. Dozer was already there, standing in the middle of the space with his arms at his sides and his expression very controlled. On the main workbench, the one they used for paperwork, for maps, for anything that needed a flat surface and reasonable light, there was something that hadn't been there when Mason left 2 days ago. A folder. Thin, manila, sitting in the center of the bench as though placed there deliberately. As though left. Mason put on gloves. He kept them in his jacket for reasons that had nothing to do with this moment but served it now. He opened the folder. Inside were photographs. 12 of them, printed on plain paper, the kind of surveillance work that didn't require professional equipment. Photographs of the garage. Photographs of Dozer's truck. Photographs of Mason's Road King outside Rachel's house, outside the summer program, outside Caulfield's steakhouse. Photographs of Eli. 3 of them. Different days, different angles. Eli at the program gate. Eli in Rachel's front yard. Eli on the porch railing, reaching toward where Mason's bike had been parked. Mason did not move for a long moment. He stood at the workbench with the folder open in his gloved hands, and he looked at the photographs of a 6-year-old boy who woke up at 5:15 and kept a die-cast motorcycle on his nightstand. He put the folder down very carefully. Dozer was watching him from across the room. Dozer had seen his face do the thing it was doing and had the wisdom to say nothing. This was not Derek Lowe. Derek Lowe sat outside houses at midnight and sent texts and stood on porches. Derek Lowe was a small, domestic kind of damage. This was something with resources, something with patience, something that had put a man into their garage for 40 minutes and left this folder and photographed a child over multiple days without any of them knowing. And that meant either they had a serious failure of awareness, which was possible but which Mason did not want to believe, or they had been targeted by someone who was very good at this, someone for whom this was not personal and emotional the way it was for Derek, but professional in the way that made it far more dangerous. Sergeant arrived at 2:47 a.m. He looked at the folder without touching it. He looked at the photographs. He closed the folder. He looked at Mason. "Who else?" he said. "I don't know yet." "But it's not the boyfriend." "No." "So the boyfriend is a coincidence." "The boyfriend is a distraction," Mason said. Sargent was quiet. He had the look he got when he was organizing information into architecture, building the shape of something from its components. "Michael Parker," he said. Mason went still. "You said it was connected," Sargent said. "You said everything seems to be connected." "I don't know what Michael Parker has to do with—" "Neither do I," Sargent said. "But I think we need to find out." He looked at the photograph of Eli on the porch railing, at the careful framing of it, at the deliberate nature of its composition. Because someone is interested in this family in a way that predates you, and that means the question isn't just who you made angry. He looked at Mason. It's who Michael Parker made angry 14 months ago, before he died on that highway in a crash that everyone assumed was an accident. The garage was completely silent. Mason looked at the photograph. He looked at Sargent. He thought about a dark road and a car that had come into Michael's lane and the specific violence of that. Not road rage violence, not distracted driver violence, but the cold, precise violence of a wheel turned deliberately at the right moment by someone who knew what they were. The crash had not been an accident. Mason sat with that knowledge in the garage at 3 a.m. and let it change the shape of everything. It wasn't difficult. The pieces were already there, they had been there, and he hadn't been looking at them from the right angle. A car into Michael's lane on a dark stretch of highway. No skid marks in the incident report, which Sargent had pulled within 20 minutes of Mason's call because Sargent knew people who knew people, and the middle of the night was not an obstacle. No mechanical failure noted, just impact, and Michael Parker going off the road, and a truck that hadn't stopped. A truck that hadn't stopped. "What did he do?" Mason said. "Michael, what did he do for work?" Dozer had his phone out. "Pulling it now." The answer came back in 4 minutes. Michael Parker, age 34, had been a forensic accountant contracted to a federal task force out of Nashville. The task force had been investigating financial structures connected to a land acquisition network operating across 6 Tennessee counties. The investigation had been ongoing for 2 years when Michael Parker died. It had been quietly shelved 3 months after his death due to, the language was institutional and bloodless, loss of key analytical personnel. The garage absorbed that information in silence. "Someone closed the investigation by removing the person running it," Sargent said. "And 14 months later, his family is still being watched," Carver said. He hadn't spoken in an hour. When he spoke now, it landed like something placed down. "They think he left something," Mason said. "Documents, evidence, something he pulled out of the system before—" He stopped. He thought about Rachel's kitchen. The bills on the counter, the photograph on the refrigerator, the boxes she hadn't opened since Michael died. "She doesn't know," he said. "Call her," Sargent said. He was already dialing. She answered on the second ring, awake, her voice carrying the specific alertness of a woman who had stopped sleeping deeply sometime in the last 14 months without consciously deciding to. "Mason. Rachel. Michael's work. His files. Did he keep anything at home? Some physical files, drives, anything from his contracts?" Silence. "Rachel. There are boxes," she said. "In the closet in my room. I haven't opened them. I couldn't—" "Don't open them," Mason said. "Don't touch them. We're coming. What's happening?" "I'll tell you everything when I get there. Lock every door right now. Don't open for anyone but me." He heard her moving. He heard the locks. He looked at Sargent. Sargent nodded. Rex was already at the door. They rode hard. 4 bikes came off the industrial street at 3:22 a.m., and the sound of them filled the neighborhood like something deliberate, like an announcement. Mason in front, Dozer on his left, Rex and Carver behind. They didn't try to be quiet. Quiet was over. Quiet was what you did when you were working around a problem's edges. They were going through the center now. Rachel had every light in the house on. She met them at the door in the porch light with Eli on her hip. He'd woken when the bikes pulled up, and he was holding his die-cast motorcycle in one hand and looking at the 4 men on the porch with the wide-eyed assessment of a child who understood that something large was happening without understanding its shape. "Hey, Eli," Mason said. "You brought more motorcycle men," Eli said. "I did." "Is it bad?" Mason looked at him. He had made a rule about not lying to this child, and he intended to keep it. It's complicated, he said, but we're handling it. Eli considered this. He looked at Dozer, who he trusted on the basis of their croissant and gutters relationship. Dozer gave him a short nod. Eli seemed to find this adequate. Rachel handed Eli to Dozer, an act that said everything about how far they'd come in 3 weeks, the handing of her son to a large man she'd known for 12 days without hesitation, and led Mason upstairs. The boxes were in the closet, 4 of them, banker's boxes, sealed with packing tape that Rachel had applied when she'd moved his things into storage and hadn't broken since. Mason cut the tape on the first box with his knife and went through it with his phone light in the dark closet while Rachel stood in the doorway. Financial documents, personal records, nothing obviously operational. Second box, same. Third box. He lifted the flap and stopped. At the bottom, beneath a layer of ordinary files, was a hard drive in a sealed plastic sleeve. Taped to the sleeve was a folded piece of paper. Handwritten. Michael's handwriting. Mason had seen it in the journal Rachel had mentioned. He recognized the forward-leaning pressure of it. He unfolded the paper. It said, "If something happens, Covenant Storage, Unit 14, key in the garage under the bench left side." Mish Mason held the paper. He held very still. Rachel was reading over his shoulder. He heard her breath change. "He knew," she said. "He knew something was possible," Mason said. "He prepared." "He didn't tell me." "He was protecting you. If you didn't know, you couldn't be asked." "He was protecting me," she said again, but differently this time. The same words doing different work, moving from understanding into something that was going to become grief later, when there was time for grief. His phone rang. "Spec," he answered. "We have a vehicle," Spec said. "Black SUV, no plates, been sitting on the corner of Aldine and Marsh for 40 minutes. Not Derek Lowe's car. 2 occupants visible." Mason's jaw set. "How long to reach you?" "If they move toward the house, 4 minutes. Maybe 3. He looked at Rachel. "Get Eli. You're coming downstairs." "Mason, now." He went to the door and called down, "Dozer." One word. Dozer appeared at the bottom of the stairs in 3 seconds. Mason held up 2 fingers, pointed to the street. Dozer turned to Rex without a word. They had 60 seconds of reorganization. Rachel coming downstairs with Eli against her chest, Carver moving to the back of the house, Rex at the front window watching the street, Dozer at the door. Before Spec called again. "They're moving," Spec said. "One on foot. The driver stayed." "Direction." "Your street." Mason looked at Dozer. "One coming in. Driver on standby." Dozer's face did the thing it did when he'd already calculated the situation. "2 of us go out," he said. "We don't wait for him to come to the door." "Agreed." "I want Carver here." "Done." He looked at Rachel. She was standing in the middle of her kitchen holding Eli and looking at Mason with the expression that was past fear, past the careful management of fear. She was somewhere on the other side of it, in the place where things become very simple because complexity is no longer affordable. "Whatever happens," Mason said, "you stay in this kitchen. Carver doesn't leave this room." Mason, Rachel. He held her gaze. "We have this." He went out the front with Dozer. The night was still warm, the street yellow-orange under the sodium lights. The cicadas down for the night and replaced by the specific silence of residential streets after 2 a.m. The figure coming down the sidewalk was a man in dark clothing, moving with the purpose-built lack of haste of someone who didn't want to be running when he arrived. Mason stepped off the porch. The man stopped. He was mid-40s, solid, with the non-expression of someone professionally trained to have one. His right hand was at his side in a way that was technically relaxed and practically not. "This is a private residence," Mason said. "I just need to talk to Mrs. Parker," the man said. His voice was flat, regional neutral, the voice of someone who had trained regionality out of it. "She's not available." "It's important." "I'm sure it is." The man's eyes moved from Mason to Dozer and back. He was recalculating. Whatever he'd expected at this address at 3:30 a.m., it was not 2 men already on the porch. "The drive," the man said. "We just want the drive." "Don't know what you're talking about," Mason said. "Mr. Mercer." He knew Mason's name. He said it with the ease of someone for whom this was already researched, already filed. There's a hard drive that belongs to an ongoing inquiry. Mrs. Parker is holding federal property without knowing it. We're here to retrieve it. Federal? Dozer said. His voice was flat. Yes. You have ID on you, Dozer said. Federal credentials. Because federal people carry those. A pause. This is a sensitive inquiry. Yeah, Dozer said. Show me your credentials. The man's hand moved, not to his pocket. Wrong direction. Mason moved first. Not toward the man. He stepped to the left, which changed the geometry, which put the man between the sodium light and the shadow and disrupted whatever calculation was happening in the man's peripheral awareness. Dozer moved right at the same moment, and the man pulled up short with two large men suddenly on different axes, and the decision tree he'd arrived with was no longer adequate. Stop, Mason said. The man stopped. His hand was still wrong. He was very still. Whatever was on Highway 12, Mason said, and whatever Michael Parker put in that storage unit, and whatever you think is in that house, none of it is going anywhere tonight. And whatever happens to us, there are 6 other people who know where everything is. So the math on this doesn't work the way you came here thinking it would. The man looked at him. His face was a controlled surface, and under it something was moving that Mason could read because he'd been reading this kind of face for 20 years. The man was deciding whether Mason was telling the truth. In the distance, very faint, there was the sound of motorcycles. Not one, multiple. Coming from the direction of the industrial district, low and even, the sound of an approach that was not hurrying because it didn't need to. The man heard it. He looked down the street. He looked back at Mason. 6 other people, Mason said. The sound of the bikes grew. 4 headlights appeared at the far end of the street. Spec, Yunts, truck, sergeant, coming in steady, not fast. The particular sound of engines that had been running together long enough to find a common rhythm. The man in dark clothing looked at the lights. He looked at Mason. He looked at the house behind Mason and whatever was inside it that he'd been sent to retrieve. He made a calculation. He took 3 steps back. Then he turned and walked toward the corner at the same purposeful non-hurry, and Mason watched him go, and watched the black SUV at the corner roll forward to meet him, and watched it make a right onto Marsh Street and disappear. The 4 bikes reached the house and idled down and went quiet. Sergeant got off his and walked up to Mason on the porch and looked at the empty corner. They'll send someone better next time, Sergeant said. I know, Mason said. We have maybe 48 hours before they recalibrate and come back with something we can't walk down with 4 headlights. I know. What's in the storage unit? Mason looked at him. Everything Michael Parker died for, he said. 2 years of forensic accounting across 6 counties, names, structures, money. The thing that got him killed and the thing that's had his family watched for 14 months. Sergeant was quiet. We put it in the right hands, Mason said. Real federal. People who aren't connected to the network he was investigating. We do it fast, and we do it public enough that there's no percentage in coming back here. You know people who can move that fast, Sergeant said. Dozer does. Dozer, standing beside Mason, said, I know someone in Memphis, ex-JAG. She doesn't sleep. Call her, Mason said. Inside the house, through the window, he could see the kitchen light. He could see Rachel standing at the counter with Eli, who had his head against her shoulder. He could see Carver at the door, a large, steady presence between that kitchen and anything that would try to reach it. He looked at that window for a moment. He thought about a man on a dark highway who had stopped to help a stranger and then spent 2 years quietly building a case that could burn the people who eventually killed him for it. He thought about the kind of person who does that, who carries that weight without putting it on anyone else, who prepares a fallback in a banker's box in a closet because he knows the risk, but doesn't know how to stop doing the right thing. He thought about Eli on the porch railing reaching toward where a motorcycle had been parked. Dozer, Mason said. Make the call. Dozer was already on his phone. Mason walked back to the front door. He went inside. Rachel looked up when he came into the kitchen, and he crossed the room and stood in front of her, and she looked at him with the expression that had moved through fear and out the other side into something that was just true. Just her, just what she felt, without the management of it. Is it over? She said. Almost, Mason said. What does almost mean? He looked at her. He looked at Eli, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the die-cast motorcycle still in his hand, thumb curled around the frame of it the way he probably curled it around things in his sleep. It means we have one more thing to do, Mason said, and then I'm going to tell you everything, every piece of it, from Highway 12 to tonight. And after that, he stopped. He breathed once. After that, you get to decide what comes next. She looked at him. Her eyes did the thing they did when she was reading him fully, not the surface of him, but the actual shape of what he was carrying. You already know what I'm going to decide, she said. He said nothing. Mason? Her voice was quiet, just his name, just the weight of it. You already know. Outside, Dozer's voice was low and rapid on the phone to Memphis. The other bikes were ticking as their engines cooled in the night air. The street was still and yellow-orange and empty, and somewhere on the other side of Coopersville, a black SUV was driving toward people who were going to be told that the operation had not gone as planned, and those people were going to make a new plan, and the new plan was going to come back here, and Mason had 48 hours to make sure that when it arrived, there was nothing left to find. Dozer's contact in Memphis was a woman named Clara Reeves, ex-JAG, currently running a private legal practice that nobody fully understood the scope of, but that had, on 3 prior occasions, produced outcomes that the Iron Covenant had reason to be grateful for. She answered at 4 a.m. without sounding like someone who had been asleep. She listened to Dozer for 6 minutes without interrupting. Then she asked 4 questions, got 4 answers, and said, "Get me the drive and the document by 9 a.m. I'll have the right people standing in front of it by noon." They got it to her by 8:40. What happened after that moved the way things move when the right pressure is applied to the right structure. Not explosively, but with the specific inevitability of a load-bearing wall finally giving out. The names on Michael Parker's drive connected to the land acquisition network across 6 counties. The network connected to 3 county commissioners, a state-level procurement officer, and a private security firm that had been operating in the gray space between licensed investigation and something considerably less licensed. The security firm was the source of the man in dark clothing. The man in dark clothing, when federal investigators made contact 41 hours later, made the specific calculation that men in his position often make when the math stops working in their favor. He talked. It was not clean. It was not fast. These things never are. There were weeks of process and legal architecture and the particular grinding machinery of accountability that moves on its own schedule regardless of urgency. Mason was interviewed twice. Rachel was interviewed 3 times, the last time with a federal attorney present that Clara Reeves had arranged without being asked and without billing for it, which was its own kind of statement. Derek Lowe, in the end, was a minor character in a larger story, a man who had noticed the investigation's peripheral attention on Rachel and had seen in it an opportunity, a way to be useful to people with resources in exchange for information about her movements and contacts. When that came out in the federal deposition, it landed in Rachel's kitchen the same way most truths land, not with shock, but with the particular flat recognition of a thing you had suspected and had hoped to be wrong about. She was not wrong about it. She sat with that at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the drive went to Memphis, with Mason across from her and coffee between them and Eli at summer program and the house around them quieter than it had been in a long time. "He was reporting to them," she said. "Yes, the whole time. The last 2 months of it, as far as they can tell." She turned her mug, one slow rotation, the way she did. "I thought I'd chosen badly," she said. "Again, I thought it was just my judgment." "It wasn't your judgment," Mason said. He was running a specific approach. It wasn't personal failure. She looked up. "I know that. Now." She paused. "It helps. Knowing it wasn't just me being—" She stopped. "Michael used to say I was a good reader of people. After he died, I stopped trusting that." Mason was quiet. "You were the first person in 14 months that I let in," she said. "You should know that." He looked at her. He held the weight of that without putting it down or deflecting it. "I know," he said. She nodded once. She drank her coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was doing what July yards do, overgrown in the corners, the grass going long along the fence line that stood straight and properly mortared where it had been falling down 6 weeks ago. The porch step had been replaced. The gutters were clear. The flashing on the roof had been resealed by hands that belonged to men who asked for nothing and received coffee and sandwiches and Eli's comprehensive motorcycle knowledge in return. "I want to show you something," Rachel said. She got up. He followed her through the house and up the stairs, and she opened the door to Michael's office, a small room she'd been using for storage, the door usually closed. She'd been in here recently. He could tell from the arrangement of things, the boxes opened and repacked, the bookshelf straightened, the desk cleared of the accumulated weight of avoidance. On the desk was a journal. Michael's. She'd mentioned it months ago. The one she'd found that told the story of the night he'd stopped for Mason on a roadside. "I read it all the way through last week," she said. "I wasn't ready before." Mason stood in the doorway. "He wrote about you," she said. "Not by name. He didn't know your name. He wrote that he stopped for a man on the road who looked like he'd been through something that would have broken most people, and that something in the man's face made Michael think about what it meant to keep going when you have every reason not to." She paused. She was looking at the journal, not at Mason. "He wrote, 'I think I helped him. I hope I did. I think that's what we're here for.'" The room was very quiet. Mason looked at the journal on the desk. He thought about a freezing roadside and a stranger who had stopped and crouched down beside him and said, "You're worth saving, brother," to a man who hadn't believed it at the time and had spent a long time afterward not believing it. He thought about what it cost to stop, what it costs every time, and what comes back from it eventually in ways you can't predict and don't get to plan for. He was right, Mason said. He helped. Rachel looked at him. Her eyes were full, but she wasn't crying. She'd made her peace with this room and this journal, and she'd arrived on the other side of it. And what was in her face now was not grief exactly, but the thing that lives just past grief when you've gone all the way through it. A kind of clarity, luminous and worn, like something that's been through weather and come out particular. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping. Twice." He said nothing because there was nothing to say that wasn't already in the room. They went back downstairs. The chapter met on a Sunday morning the way it always had, at Hester's, in the back room with the bad light and the good coffee and the ease of men who had been through something together and come out the other side of it still standing, all 12 of them this time, even Sargent, who didn't always make Sundays. Nobody talked about the case in any detail. The federal process was running. Clara Reeves had things in hand. There was nothing left for the chapter to do except the ordinary work of being the chapter. The bikes, the garage, the routes, the small adjustments in daily movement that had been their practice for years and would continue to be. At some point, Dozer put a hand on the table and said, "Eli asked me if he could see how a transmission works. The Sportster one." "What did you tell him?" Mason said. "I told him Saturday. If his mother says yes." "She'll say yes." "I figured," Rex said without looking up from his eggs. "Kid's gonna want to ride before the year's out." "He's 6, Mason said. "I was 6 when I first—" "You were a liability at 6, Dozer said. "I was advanced." "You were a liability." The table did what tables did. Absorbed the exchange, let it settle, moved on. Carver drank his coffee. Speck read something on his phone. Truck was explaining something to Yuntz in the careful way Truck explained things when he wanted to make sure the words landed right. Sargent looked at Mason from across the table. Not for long. Just a moment, with the look he had when he was filing something. Mason looked back. He gave the small nod. Sargent gave it back. That was enough. Awesome. On a Saturday in late August, 6 weeks after the drive went to Memphis, and the black SUV disappeared from the corner of Aldine and Marsh. For the last time, Eli Parker stood in the Iron Covenant garage between Dozer and Carver and watched Carver's hands move inside an engine with the focused attention of a child storing everything. Rachel sat on a workbench at the edge of the bay with a coffee that was as terrible as advertised and that she drank anyway and had stopped pretending was anything other than terrible. She had her jacket on because the garage ran cold from the industrial fans, and she was watching her son with the expression that Mason had learned to recognize as the one she kept private, the one she didn't know he saw. Mason came in from outside and sat beside her on the workbench. He had grease on his right hand from Pete Sorrell's Electroglide, and he wiped it on a rag that wasn't going to do much about it. He picked up his own terrible coffee. They sat. "He's going to want to work here," Rachel said. "I know. Every Saturday." "Probably. You're going to have to tell him no sometimes. Dozer will have trouble with that." She looked at Dozer, who was currently crouched beside Eli, explaining something about the transmission casing with what appeared to be complete absorption. "Yeah," she said. "I see that." They were quiet for a moment. In the bay, Eli said something that made Carver make the sound he made that was closest to a laugh. Not quite, never quite, but close. The fans hummed. The light came in at the angle it came in at, through the high windows of the corrugated bay, and caught the chrome on 6 bikes parked in a row and made each of them briefly the most present thing in the room. "Mason," Rachel said. He looked at her. She looked at him. No management in it, no calculation, just her face, which he had learned in the specific way you learn things when you look at them often enough that they begin to look back. "He would have liked you," she said. "Michael." He held her gaze. He thought about a man who had stopped on a dark road and crouched down and said, "You're worth saving." He thought about the particular shape of a life that sends things forward into the world and doesn't stay to see where they land. "I think I would have liked him too," Mason said. She nodded. She looked back at Eli, who had a socket wrench now and was being supervised with the intensity of 2 large men who had collectively survived things that a socket wrench could not touch, and who were nonetheless treating the child's grip on the tool with complete seriousness. The morning held. The coffee was still terrible. The fans still hummed. Outside, the August heat pressed against the corrugated walls, and the Harleys ticked as their metal expanded in the warmth. And somewhere on the street, a truck went past, and then the sound faded and the garage was quiet again in the way that only certain places are quiet. Full, not empty. The way a room is quiet when everyone who should be there is there, and nobody needs to say so. Mason sat on the workbench beside Rachel Parker in the middle of a Saturday that had started the same as all the others, and he thought about a hand pressed flat against dark glass, and a boy's eyes looking up from asphalt, and a stranger who had stopped, and the long road between all of those moments and this one. He thought about the word family and how it was less a thing you were born into than a thing you built, slowly, out of the material that was available, imperfect material, scarred material, material that had been broken and reseeded and didn't match perfectly, but held. He thought about Michael Parker writing in a journal. "I think that's what we're here for." He drank his terrible coffee. He stayed.